the circle. Hi everyone on the screen. Nice to see you up there. Oh, I even get a wave. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. The smile and the wave, and shows me something there. Oh, another one. Thank you. I like to feel connected to all my students. So we're going to be looking at Hanina ben Dosa and contrasting some of those stories with the Choni stories, which I've taught in the past, but I never like to go a year without teaching something of Choni. So we'll see a little bit, but the focus is really Hanina ben Dosa. And we're talking about someone who lived more or less right after the destruction of the Second Temple. And Hanina ben Dosa, like Choni, represents stories of miracle makers, of the kind of rabbis who also have, to some degree, supernatural abilities, supernatural powers. They are not dominant in the rabbinic world of storytelling. In other words, even in the Torah, right? Eliyahu is not a dominant model, right? We like our Avrahams who don't do a lot of miracles, right? And Yitzchak, because then we can relate to them more. They live in the natural world, and their relationship with God reflects a more natural relationship of seeking God, and God at times making God's self known, but not on a daily basis. So one has to live in faith in the way we do as well, seeking belief, seeking a connection with God. But Hanina and Choni are interesting, and there are definitely scholars who talk about this late Second Temple period, the emergence of Jesus, the emergence of people like Jesus. Jesus was not singular. This idea that there are men who have little bags of miraculous tricks, magical tricks that they can do, that somehow they can walk on water. They are reminiscent of Elisha and Eliyahu. And Eliyahu and Elisha also have supernatural powers. They can resurrect the dead. They can sweeten toxic water by throwing some sort of stick into it. In other words, it's not unfamiliar to us. What I'm highlighting here are two of the personalities that reflect that prototype in storytelling. And I will say that we do know people today who are there's something, the Kabbalists or the Hasidic Rebbes who seem to have some sort of connection to a world that we cannot directly fathom or interact with. And I do believe whether it's the Dalai Lama, whether it's the Lubavitch Rebbe, right? I'm even holding them, two holy people who really so internally see and hear and feel God's presence that they're able to reflect that outward. And in the stories we'll see, sometimes it helps the family or community they're in. Sometimes it remains more or less a presence that perhaps we revere or are inspired by. Or at times, and with Choni, we saw this, we seek out in order to avoid doing the work we need to do. Let's go to the magic spiritual man who will bring rain, and then we don't have to fast and daven, right? So in the stories, we see the complexity of what someone like this represents, again, within a family, within a community, within the world of rabbinic storytelling. The rabbis themselves, at least with the Choni stories, are not fans of Choni. Right, we saw that, and I taught this before, where Shimon ben Shetach is deeply frustrated with a person who can kind of cut through the work that most of us need to do, which is davening, fasting, tshuva, all the things we do to repair the breaches in our lives. And Shimon ben Shetach is very wary, and we'll see a little bit of that also. But let's start with Hanina ben Dosa, because I've taught Choni before. I'm only really going to use Choni as a contrast. Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa said, Avot Gimel, Kol sheyir'at chet kodemet l'chochmato, chochmato mitkayemet. This is one of these parables. Again, we grow up very familiar with, and it has a lot of wisdom to it. If your fear of sin precedes your wisdom, your seeking of wisdom, your drive for wisdom, if you come with humility, right, whatever you think of the elections, one of the things I most deeply hope for is that there's a degree of humility in this government. The fear of something, call it God, I'll call it God, that will direct them in the leadership that they are being charged with. Hanina ben Dosa says, if you don't have fear of sin, nothing will be long lasting. I'll call that again, humility, right? This sense of, I am not the top of the totem pole. I have tremendous responsibility and I'm given tremendous responsibility and I quake before that. Then chachmato mitkayemet. And the flip is also true. If what you're seeking is knowledge, is intellect, is really the development of the rational and the cerebral, without humility, without the fear of sin, as he calls it, it's not gonna last. Right? And we certainly see in academia, right, a lot of the emptiness, a lot of the fighting that is L'Shem Shamayim. Yeah, and yeshivas as well. L'Shem Shamayim, L'Shem Shamayim. He's calling it fear of sin, I think, because this awareness that the actions I take, the consequence of my actions have import. I'm going to think deeply. And when I approach texts and learning and wisdom, I'm going to be aware of my own finiteness, right? And my fear of saying the wrong thing, understanding the wrong way, interpreting inappropriately. And anyone who learns halakha, I remember hearing this here from Rav Holland, right? The first time you're asked to really paskin a shaila, there's tremendous fear. Really, you should have it every time, right? That sense of stomach turning. Did I give the right answer? That's what Hanina ben Dosa is talking about. In other words, we can all learn the Shulchan Aruch. We can all learn a mass amount of material and apply it. Do you bring some sort of fear and trembling to the decisions that you're making? Okay. He says something else. Kol shema'asav mirabin mechochmato chochmato mitkayemet. V'kol shechochmato mirubeh b'ma'asav ein chochmato mitkayemet. I think here too something very powerful. Anyone whose deeds exceed their wisdom is enduring. Wisdom is not meant to be found in a bubble, in a vacuum, in the glass. What is it called, of academia, the very sterile world, or ivory tower of academia. You have to also live in the world, and there are deeds you have to do. And if I tie it into my tshuva lectures, right, we talk about the deeds being deeds that reflect the Yud Gimel Midot, the idea that the deeds we do reflect our living with, in relation to others, right? Chesed and emet and tzedek, then your chachma will be mitkayemet. Okay. Anyone whose wisdom exceeds his deeds, his wisdom is not enduring. If you live in the ivory tower, if you don't live with a constant awareness that you are in relation to other people and that the wisdom you gather has impact on other people, then it will not endure. That's Hanina ben Dosa. And now we're going to begin to, that's a wonderful introduction, right? Pirkei Avot, to the midrashic and rabbinic stories of Hanina ben Dosa. There was an incident involving Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa, where we find this in Kohelet Rabbah, who saw the residents of his city taking up vow offerings and gift offerings to Jerusalem. So on one hand, he lived right after the destruction, but stories sometimes play around with history. Okay. What exactly is Kohelet Rabbah? Good question. Kohelet Rabbah is a series of the Midrash Rabbah series of midrashic interpretation. The most well-known is Bereshit Rabbah. Everyone knows Bereshit Rabbah. Vayikra Rabbah is another. Those are the earliest of the rabbis. From about 400, probably till 900,000, you have more and more compilations, largely from Eretz Yisrael, if not entirely, midrashically interpreting biblical texts. Kohelet Rabbah is the series of the Megillot. So the Megillot all have rabbahs to them. Right, and for obvious reasons, there's a lot of agada in those texts, a lot of agada that can be taken out of those texts. So this text is on Kohelet Rabbah. I'll just say, and thank you for asking the question, because it allows me to go back to the Hebrew. Please turn to the first 3 lines in the Midrash, because that's what allows us to understand why this story appears in Kohelet Rabbah. Stories don't randomly appear. They appear in connection to a verse, usually from Kohelet, although, as you know from Bereshit Rabbah and the teaching I've done, many midrashim have a petichta, which is often parenthetical to the verse in, let's say, Breshit or Vayikra, and somehow gets intertwined into the text. So there are different methodologies how Midrash uses the biblical text. In this case, we're going to see something from Mishlei, and we're going to connect it to Kohelet. Divrei Kohelet and David Melech Yerushalayim. Good. This is one of the first midrashim in Kohelet. Opening pasuk. Zeh she'amar katuv beruach hakodesh al yedei Shlomo Melech Yisrael. So first of all, the midrash brings to me the traditional authorship of Kohelet. Shlomo is the author, right? And that's being brought right there, front and center, after the opening words of the entire book. Chazita ish mahir b'mlachto l'fnei melachim yityatzev. The pasuk is as follows. Remember, we talked about Kohelet ben David Melech Yerushalayim. The midrashic author, instead of continuing in Kohelet, does what often happens in the Rabbas. I go to a pasuk in another part of Tanakh that I'm going to bring in content-wise into Kohelet. And the pasuk is about a melech, melachim, right? The pasuk from Mishlei. And the pasuk is, he will have you seen a man diligent in his labor? He will stand before kings. The midrashic author is now saying, pause on Kohelet. I'm horizontally moving towards Mishlei with a pasuk that has to do seemingly with kings. But now I'm going to show you that kings and angels actually are interrelated. And that's very prominent in the Rabbas, right? This idea of using other Sukkim, Tehillim, Iyov, Mishlei, when I'm interpreting a verse from a particular text. Okay, let's take a look. So now there's an incident involving Hanina ben Dosa, and he saw the residents of his city taking up vow offerings and gift offerings to Jerusalem. And he is sitting at home and he sees this. We also know, by the way, that at that period of time, there's a lot of corruption in the priesthood. And the rabbis, looking back, are cynical about all the devotion the people have to the corrupt temple, right? That bringing up these gift offerings and vow offerings, where is it going? To the pockets of the priests? But nonetheless, Hanina ben Dosa sees this, as we're going to find out. He is truly pious and righteous, and he really wants to bring a gift to God in the temple. What did he do? He went out to the wilderness of his city and noticed a certain stone there. He does not have money, we're meant to understand, to buy an offering, right? So he goes out to like the barren backyard, right? And he wanders around and he finds a stone. Stones don't cost very much money. He broke it, he chiseled it, he polished it. It's a little bit like children who don't have money to buy their mother a gift for Mother's Day. And then they make an arts and crafts project. Sometimes, and we love it, right? The little lumped, misshapen dish that they made with their fingerprints all over it. And so he wants to desperately bring a gift to God, but he doesn't have the resources or the finances to do so. So he goes to make a homemade gift, so to speak, right? A stone that he's going to bring. I take it upon myself to bring it up to Jerusalem. But apparently we're meant to understand that it's a big stone and he needs help. He sought to hire laborers, and 5 people came before him. He said to them, will you take up the stone to Jerusalem for me? They said, now, what's unclear from the story is he wants to send it to Jerusalem. It's not clear that he himself thinks he's going to Jerusalem. Remember, it's expensive to go to Jerusalem. It's one of the things when I talk about the temple of the Second Temple, people are really poor. They stay poor for a long time. This idea of going up 3 times a year is not really realistic for the poor people living in Beersheba and Sfat. And so he wants to send it, a shaliach mitzvah. Will you take up this stone to Jerusalem for me? They said to him, give us 5 selah and we'll take it up to Jerusalem. Now, they want 5 selah. It's not an enormous amount of money. But for a man who doesn't have, he doesn't have. He sought to give it to them, but he did not have anything in his possessions at that time. This is a theme that comes up in Hanina ben Dosa's story. He's very poor. We're going to see that one of the most famous stories is about his wife who just lights the oven with nothing in it. We'll see that story, right? He's very poor. He doesn't have the money to pay to send this stone up to Jerusalem, and no one wants to do it for free. right? Today, we're actually a little shocked because Hanina ben Dosa says your deeds should come before your learning, which really means someone should say, sure, I'll take it for you, Shaliach mitzvah, right? How many people do we sometimes ask, hey, you're going back to the States, can you take something? You're coming to Israel, can you take something? We usually don't give or take money for that kind of good deed. And he cannot find anyone, and I think it's significant, who wants to take it up to Jerusalem. So what happens next? They left him and went on their way. The Holy One, here comes the miracle. Blessed be he, arranged for 5 angels to appear to him in the guise of men. He said to them, there were 5 Selah, 5 laborers, 5 angels, right? He said to them 5 books of Moses, it seems to me, right? Why the number 5? He said to them, will you take up this stone to Jerusalem for me? They said to him, give us 5 Selah. The same thing, we'll take up your stone for you, provided that you join us with your hand and finger. Now, he doesn't pay them. It's not clear to me, again, what why they're asking for money. It doesn't really matter. He joined them with his hand and finger, and they teleport to Jerusalem. Right? It's a little Harry Potter. They're standing in Jerusalem. Like they basically take his hand and finger, press it onto the stone, and then they all teleport. It's an amazing scene, right? He sought to give them their payment, but he did not find them. Now, where he suddenly gets 5 Selah from, I don't know. Remember, these are stories. He entered the chamber, the Lishkat HaGazit, where the Sanhedrin sat, and asked after them. Now, he wants to do the right thing. He's like, but I owe them money, right? So instead of basking in the mirror, being like bewildered, he kind of takes the miracle for granted. I just want to point out that that's not a problem for him. The problem is he has somehow cheated these people out of their wage, and that doesn't sit well with him. They said to them, it appears the ministering angels took your stone up to Jerusalem. And they read this verse, and here's the verse from Mishlei. Chazita ish mahir b'mlachto l'pnei melachim yitatzev. Have you seen a man diligent in his labor? He will stand before kings. Kreve l'pnei malachim yitatzev. He will stand before angels. Now, I've gained a lot by this, and let me just summarize. First of all, I gained a lot by a story that introduces this wondrous person, this personality of Hanina ben Dosa, and it illuminates to some degree, right, his righteousness in light of what's going on with all the other people going up with their vow offerings and gift offerings, right? It gives me a little insight as to some of the culture, the fact that they won't take the stone without payment, the fact that they're all marching up to Jerusalem, he has to go get a stone that he chips and chisels and so on, all on his own. But I also, because this is in Kohelet, right? And we go back to the opening verse that Kohelet is the king, Ben David, Melech Yerushalayim, you say it's Shlomo. This play on the word standing before kings, standing before angels, really to me is an awesome responsibility that the king has, right? The king can be a king. The king is also representative of the higher world, of the heavens. The mandate is by God. God is the Melech Malchei Amlachim. So what I think you have here is, first of all, what a righteous man looks like, right? But we also, in this play, if you do your work properly, and Hanina ben Dosa believes you need to work, you need to do deeds, you don't need to just learn, right? You have to integrate your learning and your actions. Then you could be standing before angels while simultaneously standing before kings. In other words, that's the integration we're looking for, that the king should be someone that models this, right? That when you stand before the king, essentially you're also standing before a malach. The melech malach interplay is what I've gained here. This idea that there's a play on words, melech and malach, and that the king and the angel, right? The king can represent the world of the angels, or standing before kings, melech malchei amlachim, and standing before angels can be synonymous with standing before someone like Kohelet. So I think that's where the Midrashic author is going, right, with this story. That the ideal, what Hanina ben Dosa and Avot tells us, fear of sin before wisdom, action before wisdom, I think is meant to also be within the gaps of the story, where a true king, how a true king will operate, right? Fear of sin and humility, action, not just wisdom, and then you have Shlomo HaMelech, right? This idea that was representative of Shlomo. So I think that's a little bit of what's happening. I think there's more to delve into. I'm not quite sure what to do. Why 5 Selah? Why 5 laborers? Why he's still looking for money when he clearly doesn't have any? There are pieces of the story that are a little choppy to me. I'm kind of interested, were there earlier versions to the story that got reworked here? I don't know. Sometimes that happens in storytelling. This was brought in Benny Lau's book, The Sages, and I didn't find parallels. but I do think it introduces us well to Hanina ben Dosa. It builds on his sayings in Pirkei Avot, and it shows us a little bit of how the Midrash is working, right? We're talking about a king, the king over Jerusalem, Kohelet, when we say is Shlomo, and even the king has to be careful, right? The king is finite. The king is not Melech Malchei Malachim. And if we do the wordplay of Melech Malach, maybe the Melech always has to be worried that he's standing before the Malachim, who are really representative of Melech Malchei Malachim. That's kind of what I feel is coming out of this Midrash. Questions, comments? Yeah.
I think one of the striking things for me is I can't imagine there were too many rabbis that actually could take a stone and break it and carve it and polish it. I mean, that's a very unique skill.
Which means that he's a laborer, right? That he's a man who has to work with his hands. Very nice. It also reminds me a little, part of what I did with Choni was to show parallel themes that appear in stories. Rabbi Akiva and Avot Rabbi Natan takes a pickaxe, the metaphor is, the mashal, and chips away stone by stone at the mountain, right? So I can't ignore another story with a pious man who seeks wisdom, right? Where also there's a stone that is being chipped. So every stone represents maybe a pasuk or something. So I don't know if that's meant to be a metaphor for it. It really is a stone, but is there a metaphor there for his Torah? I don't know, but I agree. He's a man who knows how to work with his hands. Absolutely, he is not a man who lives in the ivory tower of. He's not a Gamliel. He's not one of the wealthy. He knows how to work with his hands. It's a very specific skill.
Nechama.
Yeah.
Just looking at the text, that suddenly caught my eye that melachto and melachim.
Yes, nice.
The words.
Right,
just
beautiful. Malachto, Malachim, and then we're saying Malachim and Malachto. There are a lot of word plays in that pasuk in Mishlei.
Yeah.
Thank you. Let's take a look at the Yerushalmi, because now I do want to contrast with another character, Choni, and the miracles and the temple. We're going to look at that. I'm bringing specifically the Yerushalmi, not the Mishnah. And what happens here is the Yerushalmi and Tani, the stories we're going to see on Hanina ben Dosa, a lot of them are in Tani. Rabbi Yudan ben Gera said, this Choni the roof roller is the grandson of Choni the roof roller who lived close to the destruction of the first temple. Now I'm bringing this because the Choni stories clearly take place during the second temple period, right? Although in the Bavli, they might be a little bit later, but the earlier traditions have been very much Bayit Sheni. And he has a great grandfather who lived during Bayit Rishon. He went out to his workers in the fields. While he was there, it rained. Now, remember the rain, because Hanina ben Dosa is also going to have rainy stories. I mean, pious people are involved in the bringing of rain, or the stopping of rain, or something miraculous with rain. He went into a cave and sat down, became drowsy and fell asleep and slept for 70 years until the first temple was destroyed and the second temple was rebuilt. Now, I love this story. It's the Sleeping Beauty story, right? You go, Rip Van Winkle story. You go and you fall asleep in a cave and you wake up 70 years later. The first temple's been destroyed, the second temple's been rebuilt, and God has spared you that. On the other hand, what we don't think enough about is how traumatic that must have been to walk out to a world that the world you knew no longer exists and the people you knew in it no longer exist, looking for familiarity, right? Where are you going to find it? We'll see where he finds it. A place that was a vineyard had become an olive grove. A place that was an olive grove had become a sown field. In other words, the world is really topsy-turvy, reminiscent perhaps of Noah, who when he comes out of the ark, cannot reconcile himself to the world that was destroyed and the world that is re-emerging. I feel strongly, and this is inspired by Bryna Levy, her book, Waiting for Rain, where she brings beautiful sources from the Middle Ages of what it was like for him to lift off the roof of the ark and see the scorched earth, see the destroyed world, and how his response is to build vineyard, right? He can't live in the aftermath of such destruction. What's going to happen to Choni? Because he comes out, the world isn't destroyed, but everything is different. The olive grove, the wheat field, everything is different. He can't get his bearings. He asked, what is going on in the world? They said, do you not know what is going on in the world? He said, no. They said to him, well, who are you? He said, I'm Choni the roof roller. They said to him, we have heard that when he would go into the courtyard of the temple, not the Lishkat HaGazit, right? Hanina goes to the seat of the Sanhedrin, where the wisdom is stored, right? Where the seat of wisdom. Choni is going to the courtyard. And we heard it would become light, right? That there would be this miraculous light that would kind of surround Choni when he walked into the Azara. He went into the courtyard and it became light, right? So he regains his identity because he proves who he is by going into the courtyard. He brings light into the courtyard. Hanina ben Dosa teleported to Jerusalem with the angels, right? So we have these stories of people who are able to affect changes in the natural world, right? Supernatural changes. And then he applies a pasuk, B'shuv Adonai et Shivat Zion hayinu kechomer. Right, the pasuk works so well here. When God brought back those who returned to Zion, we were like dreamers. He's talking about himself. I was like a dreamer. I came back to Zion, and that's going to be how he can. We don't know what happens to him in the lines after, but the idea is he's found his place. He's regained his identity. There's something familiar here. It's not the first temple; it's the second temple. But there's an Azara. Right? And the light is now shining in the Azara, and he's bringing some of that from the first temple period into the second temple period. So he has stature, he has presence. Okay, that's the first Choni story. Let's go on to Hanina ben Dosa. And here's Hanina ben Dosa and rain. Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa was traveling along a road when it began to rain. And what does he say? Let's take a look in the Hebrew on the right column. Oh no, sorry, I don't have the Hebrew for this. I only have it for the next one. Yeah, I don't know why I screwed that up. He said before God, Ribona Shalala, the entire world is comfortable because they need rain, but Hanina is suffering because I'm wet. The rain ceased. When he arrived home, he said, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ribona Shalala, the entire world is suffering, and Hanina is comfortable. The rain began. Okay, I think we can also. This is very reminiscent of Choni, who draws the circle and says to God, yeah, no, not strong enough, too weak, too strong, like, you got to get it right, God, right? There's this familiarity. There's this comfort level that Hanina has in dialogue with God. It starts to rain. It reminds us a little, right, of Tevye talking to his horse or talking to God, right, when he's out and so on. God does not respond to Tevye in the way God responds to Hanina ben Dosa. But there's a comfort level. It started to rain. He's getting drenched. He says to God, really? Like, can't you wait till I get home? And the rain stops. And we love that. It's a great story. And then he gets home, and immediately, what does he think about the people? He's aware of the consequence of his request, the consequence of his actions. I will say this is different than Choni. Choni, in the story in the excerpt, I didn't bring it. In Ta'anit, it goes as follows. He manages to get lots of rain. So much so that things begin to be washed away, right? They have to go up to Harabayit and there's too much rain. And he's kind of like, well, what do you want from me? Like, I brought rain, like I did my thing. Go do your own thing. Go get God, like he seems to be totally baffled why they would come back to him. He doesn't seem to have full consideration for the consequence of what he has put into place. So much so that Shimon ben Shechem, the story in the Babylonian Talmud, which is longer than in the Mishnah, says that when the rain stops and the sun comes out, the people go out to search for mushrooms and truffles. And Shimon ben Shechem is like incensed. They don't bring sacrifices. They don't thank God. They don't they're completely like, oh yeah, I had a party, picnic, let's go get some mushrooms, right? And Shimon ben Shechem says, look what you've done. Right? You haven't done anything educational. Hanina ben Dosa is aware that by stopping the rain, right, it's going to have consequence on everyone else. And so as soon as he gets home, right, he comments on that. He owns it. He says to God, okay, bring the rain, and the rain begins. Right, in the Choni stories, Choni never asks God for a time limit. He said, okay, just let it rain. And then there's too much rain, and now what do we do, right? Now, in one of the stories, he goes back and asks for the rain to stop, but in one of the stories, he doesn't. But I will say that to me stands out as an interesting difference between the two. Now let's go on. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Ta'anit. This is all in Ta'anit between pages like 23 and 26. You have a series of stories about Hanina ben Dosa and Choni Hama'agel and Choni's grandson, who I really love, Abba Chilkiah. I love his wife, and we're going to see that. So every day, here we are. B'chol yom v'yom bat kol yotzei ba'omeret kol ha'olam nizon. I'm on page 2, just that little passage in Hebrew. Bishvil Hanina banai, v'Hanina b'nei. V'Hanina b'ni dayo b'kav charubim me'erev Shabbat l'erev Shabbat. Okay, so this again, amazing. Choni is also called my son. right? That, again, there are these people who are so close to God. They have a parent-child relationship. This idea of, hey, I'm getting wet. Can you do something? And then, hey, I'm dry now. Can you do something? Hanina, a bat kol comes out and says, the entire world is sustained for Hanina ben Dosa, and all he asks for is a basket of carrots. That's what sustains him from one Erev Shabbat to another. Again, he's ascetic, he lives in a kind of dire poverty, and because of this, asceticism, simplicity, I sustain the world. Okay. So what would happen? Have a regila debitu the mechama tanua komale deshata deshadya aktarta. So every Erev Shabbat, his wife would heat the oven and create smoke. Unless you think, it doesn't tell us what she's using. She could be using straw. And if I go to a Rabbi Akiva story where he collected straw for a living, they lived in dire poverty. He collects straw and burns the straw for fuel. And his neighbors say, can we give you some oil, some heating fuel? Because the smell of the straw is killing us, Akiva. And Akiva says, no, I want to be self-sufficient, whatever he said, which I think, by the way, is a missed opportunity. We should let the neighbors help him, but that's a different story. Maybe we'll get to it in Akiva's story. So she's probably burning straw, which again would have been accessible and cheap and so on, to make it seem like she's baking bread. They don't even have bread. Now, I'm teaching Tuvot at Pardes, and it's known in the Mishnah there that Hamashret Isha al Yedei Shalish, if a man leaves his wife to be supported by an apotropos, by a guardian, she's entitled to 2 kav, which is 12 eggs worth of wheat. It's enough for anywhere from 14 to 18 meals of bread, right? That's what she's entitled to. However, this story tells me that if her husband does not leave her with a guardian and she's living at home with her husband, she eats what he eats. And he's eating a kav, which is roughly 8 eggs worth or 6 eggs worth of carobs every week, like not a very big diet or diverse diet. And it's one of the few stories where we have a woman and a wife and what it's like to live with such a pious, ascetic man. And she's embarrassed. She's embarrassed by their poverty. She's embarrassed that people know they have so little to eat. She might not have an issue with the diet, but the idea that others know how poor she is. So she fakes it, right? Every week she heats up the oven and as if they are baking. And what happens, and again, this is a great story because it's like, you need an evil neighbor. She had a shivavata bishta, an evil neighbor. She was like Vivayeshota, Busha, right? She wanted to humiliate her. Amara, Mifte Yadana delayed Lahu Velanugi. I know they have nothing. Like, what am I kidding? My Kulehai, Aslo Trefa Baba, Ikasva Vaile Indrona. I'm going to go. She went and knocked on Aslo Trefa. She went and knocked on the door. Ikasva, Rabbi Hanina's wife was embarrassed, and she went up to an Indurona, into an inner room. And then what happened? I might as well go to the English because at this point it's all Aramaic. A miracle was performed. The neighbor let herself in, right? The nosy neighbor, the nosy evil neighbor, and sees the oven is filled with bread and the kneading basin is filled with dough, right? She thought she was going to catch her in this very poor, very empty kitchen and like go around telling all the neighbors, oh my God, this woman, do you see how they live? Do you see how her husband has her live? Like she doesn't have anything. And instead, she walks in and it's the Elisha, it's the Eliyahu stories, right? We know these from the Elisha and Eliyahu. Particularly, if you remember, there's a story with Eliyahu. I think it's Eliyahu with the oil that doesn't stop. It's Eliyahu, right? I think Elisha has a similar story, but this is Eliyahu, where a woman is so poor that her sons are about to be sold into slavery, right? She's a widow, and she cries to Eliyahu, and Eliyahu says, gather all of your materials, all your vessels, and take the last little bit of oil you have and pour it in and you'll see. And she keeps filling like bucket after bucket after bucket. She borrows from all of the neighbors and then it gets to it, right? So this to me is a little like that, right? The miraculous dough that suddenly overflows everywhere. The miracle of the loaves, I will say, of the wife of Hanina ben Dosa. And she said to Rabbi Hanina, instead of saying, oh my God, look at this woman who has nothing, she says, oh my God, your bread is burning, you better bring a shovel. And she said to her neighbor, Yes, of course. That's why I went in. I went to get a shovel. That's where I was going, right? So she spins it. She graciously or gracefully gets herself out of that. And that week they have bread to eat. Doesn't tell us it's going to continue. Atana then taught, and this is Benny Lau points out, that the Gemara then adds a line to the story, which he thinks is not original to the story. Of course, she entered the inner room to bring a shovel because she was accustomed to miracles. I think that detracts a little from the story. I think, right, they add that as if like she expected it. She knew there would be a miracle. I don't think she lives in expectation of miracles. I think she's a woman who lives in poverty with her husband. I'd like to think she supports her husband. And as the woman of the house, she's acutely aware of what the neighbors think, and particularly this evil neighbor. And she spends her life a little bit trying to prevent their exposure and humiliation. He's completely oblivious, right? Which again, makes sense. It fits so well with so many, so many stories and real stories. And then this miracle happens to spare her humiliation. Rabbi Hanina's wife then says to him, this story really throws her over the edge. The fact that she almost got caught, right? The fact that this woman was willing to expose her and take away her dignity and so on. And she basically says to him, until when will we continue to suffer like this? Yeah, I love this story because we're having a real conversation between husband and wife, a journey that they're on together. His actions certainly affect her. And she's getting tired. And she says, how long is this going to happen? He said to her, what can we do? Pray for, and she says, pray for mercy. Meaning you and God are really tight, and maybe something will be given to you from heaven. So he prayed for her. He's like, okay, prays for mercy. And the palm of a hand emerges and gave him one leg of a golden table. It's a very famous story. They love to tell this in like Koasu Chachamim books. That night, his wife saw in a dream that in the future, the righteous will eat at a golden table that has 3 legs, but she'll be eating on a table with 2 legs. Now, I'm curious to know what you think of the story, because of course she's now going to realize there's consequence. If we have reward in this world, we won't have reward in that world. When she told her husband this story, he said to her, are you content that everyone will eat at a complete table and we'll eat at a defective table? She said to him, but what can we do? Pray for mercy that the legs be taken away. He prayed for mercy and it was taken away. And the last miracle was even greater because God doesn't usually take back. He only gives, right? So it's a great story. It's a great story because what we have in it is this marital relationship that's kind of been pushed to the breaking point. And she has a voice and she says to her husband, how long do we have to suffer? You pray for everyone else. Why can't you pray for me? Right? Why can't you pray for us? And he agrees. And then they get this golden table, golden leg. And in the course of the story, she comes to realize that she's a partner. She's going to be eating at that table with him in the world to come. That it's not just supporting him, right? Just putting up with it, so to speak. She's actually going to be rewarded equally with him in the world to come. And that very much empowers her. And she basically says, okay, now what can we do? I regret it. I want to be sitting with you at a table that has 3 legs. It's the polar opposite of the wicked neighbor who's going to humiliate them. In the world to come, she suddenly is like, I don't want to have 2 legs in the world to come. I want to be like everyone else in the world to come, everyone else up there in the world of the righteous. And then he helps as well, right? Then he says, okay, I'm going to help you. We see a husband who's very receptive, right? He responds to his wife. When she finally comes to him. And then at the end, right, the story ends where it ends. So I think as a story, first of all, it's great. It has a lot of things you could do with it. I'd rather not go to, we should all suffer in abject poverty in order to get to the world to come. I don't think that's the takeaway. I think this particular story is about a man who has chosen a life of asceticism as part of his spiritual mandate. I will say my daughter right now lives right across from Aryeh Levine's house in Nachlaot. That is a tiny home, right? That is someone who chose a life of simplicity. And from what I understand from what I've read about him, he and his wife embraced that, right? That was part of their spiritual relationship with God and with Am Yisrael. But it's not for everyone. And I don't think we're meant to think it's for everyone. In this story, what makes it complex is he's chosen it. She seems to have gone along with him until she suddenly begins to question whether this is the life she wants to. And at the end of the story, she embraces it. She's the one who initiates the return of the leg. Says, you know what? Wow, in the world to come, I'm going to be sitting up there. I'm no longer going to be embarrassed. I'm not going to be doing without. that to me is enough to put up with this. Because by the way, a two-legged table can stand, right? I'm sure many of us have two-legged tables. It's just, again, the idea that I had 3 legs going to 2 legs and we're going to stand out as being without. No, I don't want that. Now that I understand the consequence. Anyone have a comment or something based on? Yeah.
And what came out of this for me was that he could be leaving. He didn't think to actually ask for the story until she pointed it out to him. They had such a great relationship that he just didn't see it and he didn't realize that he had to ask for it. This one could have given it to him, but he didn't.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I don't know how many of you are married to doctors or are doctors maybe, but I will say doctors are often on call for the whole community. And anyone who's the child of a doctor will say that at times, not anyone, but I know children of doctors who will say their doctor parent was at times dismissive of their own medical situations, right? Because they were so attentive to everyone else. Now it's probably not the way, like, you know, and often you have to go to another doctor, by the way, in order, you're not really supposed to go, in fact, you're not supposed to go to your parent as a doctor because of that. I think he doesn't see it. It doesn't affect him. It doesn't bother him. The Bakul has told us that because of Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa, the world is sustained because he only eats this kav of charubin. And what the story does so beautifully is it suddenly says, well, what about his wife? Where is she in this? Like the world is sustained for him. And she discovers at the end of the story, the world is sustained for her too, essentially, right? It's both of them. So I think there's a lot of movement here and growth and interrelationship between husband and wife and awareness. If I do want to take away, right, it's that spouses in a relationship, right, are on a journey together. If one person makes a decision to move to Israel, and the other person is not always, it may not want to go to Israel, but goes along with their spouse, right? Both of them are on this struggle, challenge, journey together, and both of them face the consequences and the rewards or the consequences. So I think there's a lot to do with the story besides what sometimes the Koatsu Chachamenu kind of genre does. I think that it's actually a very beautiful story, a very deep story.
I have a question though. Why are we idealizing this? I mean, it must be because of the other things he does, not for this. I mean, where is living in poverty one of our ideals? I mean, I don't get that.
The part of living in poverty, I would say 2 things to that. First of all, there are people who live in poverty because they live in poverty. In other words, there are people who choose to serve, if you know, a rabbi who chooses instead of, you know, chooses to take a minimal salary and have a lot of children so that they have to live simply, maybe even poorly, with minimal and so on. There are choices people make. That's someone who goes into chinuch, right? We all know that. Sometimes will do it because they know they have parents who can support them, but increasingly, right, there aren't that generation of support for the kollel, for the you know, we all know there's a crisis in the Haredi and Yeshiva communities because my generation was still able to be supported by parents, and my children's generation, you know, if you have 10 children, they have 10 children. And so poverty in the Haredi community is a big thing, and they want to be less poor, but it's also, there is a value in sacrificing for Torah. There is a value to that, and not putting too much emphasis on consumerism and on having things and so on. That said, there's a struggle in being poor, and I'm just going to use what I've read about the community and the few conversations I've had with Haredi women. They want to be less poor. That's actually a big change between previous generations in the Haredi world and today. They want to go on vacations, they want to have decent clothes, nice sheitos, and so on and so forth. So that struggle of, we don't value poverty, but there are people, righteous, pious, ascetic people, who embrace the poverty because they see their lives as having meaning in spiritual richness as opposed to physical. I think that's what's being explored here. I think Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa does not mind his poverty. It doesn't bother him. He lives simply. Again, if I look at Rari Levin, lived very, very, very simply. It was a choice. Could a man that brilliant not have gone on to have made more money? I mean, he probably, I'm sure he could have been the whatever. But a lot of times the pious people we meet who live simply, we actually are often inspired and in admiration of that. Living in poverty where you can't feed your children is different than living very simply. They have food. It's just the same food every week, right? They have the kav of karuvim that is provided, kind of like Eliyahu lived in a cave and was supported for 3 years by God, right? They have just what they need to survive. And so I don't think the story here is you should live poorly. I really don't. If that's anyone's takeaway, wow, then I think they're really being very shallow reading of the story. Yeah, right, let me take a few more comments and then we'll come back to it. You want to ask that?
I was going to say that I think that the usually between the two stories of Nechama here brings, I guess, us through Reina's life to experience the same sort of thing that he did, which with the awareness of how the rain affects others.
Right.
Right? Like we would recognize that, oh, like the rain affects me, so the rain affects others. So I need to remember the others. And she's saying your poverty
is affecting me, and you're not even noticing it, right? But the story, what's beautiful about the story is it gives her a voice.
Yeah.
She expresses it to him, and he doesn't dismiss her. He doesn't do the Yaakov Atachat Elohim thing. Like he doesn't dismiss her. He acknowledges it and he says, you know what? I'm gonna take care of your poverty. We can get out of this. God will provide, but then realize where this is gonna lead to. Yeah.
This is touching a very, very touchy point.
Go ahead. Please, by the way, stories do that. That's fine. Please try to shut the phone. I know you're trying. Yeah.
The whole idea of relying on miracles, when I bring it down to today, and it's a very personal story. It's when I heard it, I mean, here, even going back to the trip to Yerushalayim, it really ended up relying on a miracle. And where was he going to get the money to pay that he wanted to pay? He didn't have the money. So when I'm relating today, bringing it down today, I heard over and over again, Hashem will provide. Hashem will provide gets translated in very real terms that there are people out there, they're relying on stuff. They're not really, in many, many cases, Rabbi Levine took on a life
of simplicity.
His children didn't wear the name brands. Now what I'm seeing is we're relying on stucco, but our children are going to wear the best brands.
I think, first of all, I appreciate you saying that. Yeah. I think you're expressing a tension that if I love the fact that stories bring up these things. And I think if there's truth, right? We then begin to explore what does a life of poverty mean for any of us? Is that a value, like you asked? Is that something any of us should be striving for? And I do want to say, again, this is not meant to condemn any particular community. I think there are a lot of people going out to work in those communities, and when they say God will provide, in many communities, there has to be hishtadlus, right? Not just passive accepting. Are there people who take advantage of it? Of course. But I think overall, that tension of how simply do I have to live in a world that has become very consumerist is an enormous question that we're asking today. And that's why I think on one hand, we can teach Hanina ben Dosa and his wife, and maybe we can teach it in seminary and try to inspire those Kollel wives to want to kind of buckle down and live simply and so on and so forth. But when it gets to what you're talking about, the community has to do a cheshbon nefesh, and I don't have to do that because I'm not living in that community, but I appreciate what you're saying. And I think they are undergoing a certain cheshbon nefesh because of the numbers are just enormous, and the resources are limited, and a lot of them are going out to work. Okay, let's move on. Now we have two more stories of miracles. I have two more also following in the same thread. One Shabbat evening, Hanina ben Dosa saw his daughter was sad. So again, he notices, right? Good. He said to my daughter, "Why are you sad?" He said, "I confused a vessel of vinegar for a vessel of oil, and I lit the Shabbat lamp with vinegar," which means now. Remember, Honey Ben on Goldman's light. She's now lit vinegar. It's Shabbos already. She confused vinegar for oil. By the way, vinegar is cheaper than oil. So in my mind, also, it could be the oil bottle no longer has oil, it has vinegar, right? Oil is relatively expensive, although there are poor oils you can use. And she's basically saying, it seems to be, I know the commentary here, this is Baria, soon the lamp will be extinguished. It seems to be, there is no fire. Vinegar doesn't burn. Why is that fact? What? Vinegar doesn't burn. And there's that period of time. Remember, we light candles like 40 minutes before Shabbos. I think he's coming upon her as it's getting dark. And in a minute, we're going to be in the dark. And he said to her, my daughter, what are you concerned about? He said to the oil that it should burn, and say to the vinegar that it should burn. And that lamp burned continuously the entire day until they brought from it light for Abdallah. Okay, well, there's another miracle, the miracle of the loaves, the miracle of the fire, the miracle of the water, right? There are lots of miracles associated with Hanina ben Dosa. What's most interesting is that he's a singular character. In other words, we don't have a lot of Hanina ben Dosas for good in the rabbinic storytelling genre. The idea of a person going around, being able to overturn the laws of nature is not it's not something we worship. It's not something we seek. We're aware. I think I'm not going to weigh in on do I think he did these miracles or not. Please don't ask that, right? I think these are wonderful stories, and I think he is being presented as a person who and we know people like this who kind of exist in other worlds, right? He has the ability to interact with other worlds that I can relate to. I can, relate to people who can do marvelous things. Maybe he had slipped a little oil into the lamp, who knows? And that's why, right? I can even explain many of the miracles more naturally. But the point is, he's aware of her distress. He notice the order. It's about him and the rain, and he's aware of the world. Then his wife brings to his attention what's going on in the house, and he's receptive. And that leads to the next story where he notices his daughter's distress, right? So I do think the storyteller has put these very deliberately in an order, right? Opening awakeness. Hold on 1 minute, let me just finish this last thing and then I'll get your comment. Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa had some goats. His neighbor said to him, your goats are damaging our property. I'm glad he has some goats. He said to them, if they are causing damage, let them be eaten by bears. But if they are not, let each of them bring a bear home. And they did. Each one brought a bear and impaled between its horns. What do you have to worry? Come on, you're going to remember that story. And so each goat comes home with a bear in its horns, which is just tremendous visual. Again, this it's very easy for the neighbors to blame him. He's a relatively easy target, and yet he's not a wimp. He's not going to let them just take his goats or blame him for something that's not his. And because he has this, kind of miraculous bag of tricks, he's able to do something like this, and it's just very matter of fact, right? He conflates the laws of nature and above this, natural and supernatural, without issue, right? Rain, don't rain, oil can become vinegar, can become oil, goats can become bears. Like, he lives in a different world than the rest of us live in, and he's not constantly showing off his miracles, right? But when he needs them, they're available to him. Yes.
Just wanted to say, one of the stories that I remember, that they came to the rabbi to pray for rain, and he prayed, and the rain didn't come.
Right,
So he told his wife to pray for the.
I'm about to bring you that story. That's the story. Yeah.
That's it.
Yes. Well, do you want to finish your comment? Yes.
So the wife prayed for the rain, and the rain came.
Yes.
So it's sometimes from what I learned is that the bracha in the household comes from the woman.
I'm going to get to that.
Okay.
Yes, I'm going to bring that. Okay. Thank you. You see, look how you already put together this story with the Abba Chokia story. Very good. It's why I brought it next, even though I've taught it before, just to review it, to reconnect it. And thank you. You already did that beautifully. And now we're going to see the story inside. So thank you. So what we're going to find out is this is one of Choni's descendants. Abba Chokia was the son of Choni Hamagel's son. So he's the grandson. And when the world was in need of rain, they would send sages to him, and he would pray for mercy, and rain would fall. Right? He is known for being able to pray and bring rain. Once the world was in need of rain, and the sages sent a pair of sages to him so that he would pray for mercy and rain would fall. They went to his house, but they did not find him there. This very much has a once upon a time follow. They went to the field and found him hoeing the ground. They greeted him, but he did not return their greetings. Towards evening, as he was gathering firewood, he placed the wooden hoe on one shoulder and his cloak on the other. Along the entire way, he did not wear his shoes, but when he reached water, he put on his shoes. When he reached an area filled with shrubs and thorns, he lifted up his clothes. When he reached the city, his wife came out to greet him, adorned with finery. When he reached his house, his wife entered first. He entered after, and afterwards the two sages entered. He sat and ate bread, but he did not say to the sages, come and eat. He divided bread to his children. To the elder child, he gave one piece. To the younger child, he gave two. So it very much has this okay, why are you telling me all this information? Wait and see, you're going to find out. But we're getting all this in the story. Proceed. Abba Chokia said to his wife, I know that these sages have come due to the rain. Let's go up to the roof and pray for mercy. perhaps the Holy One, blessed be he, will be appeased and it will rain and we will not receive credit ourselves, right? Like maybe God will already send rain. We don't want to receive credit. Let's go up to the roof. Let's hide from them. Let's have the rain fall and then God will get credit and not us. Okay. They went up to the roof. He stood in one corner and she stood in the other. And this is what you're remembering. Clouds began to form on the side where his wife stood and it began to rain. When he descended, he said to the sages, why have you come? It's raining. They said to him, the other sages sent us so that you should pray for mercy for rain. He said to them, blessed is God who did not require you to petition Avothopia. Okay, so that's the end of part one of the story. The rain comes. We now know, because we as readers saw that the wife went into the corner, that it came from her side of the roof, not from his side. They come down, he's like, why'd you even come? It's right there. I'm like, go home. Like, it has nothing to do with me. We all know it has to do with him, and it turns out it has to do with his wife. Now comes what I think is the point of the story, a very interesting conversation. What's interesting about the conversation is that they get an opportunity to ask Abichilkia about all the weird things he did, all the mundane but also surprising behavior he presented on their trip from the field back to the home and in the home. And through that, we're going to learn a lot also. They said to him, okay, we know the rain has come on your account. Like, you're not fooling us. We know that. However, let the master please say to us these aspects of your behavior that puzzle us. What is the reason when we greeted the master did not return our greeting? He said to them, I'm a day laborer, and I said I may not delay my work to answer you. In other words, I'm being paid by someone else, and starting to talk to you would have been a whole time. Hello, how are you? Where are you from? Shalom Aleichem, right? And I take very seriously that I'm on the clock. That's just who I am. What is the reason you carried the firewood on one shoulder and the cloak on the other? Oh, it was a borrowed robe. I borrowed it to wear it. I did not borrow it to put wood on it, right? So again, we see a person who's very scrupulous about his relationship to others, right? To his employer, to the person he borrowed from. And he doesn't cut corners. And even in these moments, he is conscious of what he owns and what he doesn't. What is the reason the master did not wear shoes? When he reached water, he put on his shoes. He said to him, well, the entire way I can see, but in water, I can't see. All right. Oh, really smart. Okay. And remember, this is someone who obviously needs to preserve his shoes, right? You're not going to wear your shoes if you don't need your shoes, so as not to wear them out. Interesting that you're going to wear them in water, right? But in water, the squishy bottom, right? I don't know what's down there. I don't want to touch, step in the water and not see. What is the reason you lifted your clothes when you reached shrubs? Well, he said the flesh will heal, but the garment will not heal. Now, this, by the way, shows someone who's acutely aware of everything he owns, right? A little bit of an answer, right? When we have consumerism and we have lots of clothes and lots of shoes and so on, no one garment means that much. We're not as careful with our things. But if you read, books that I've read where a pair of shoes means something, and every night you take them off and you polish them and you put them in their bag, right? When people have little, they value what they have. They know it can't be easily. All the Time Family, that series of books where they're actually quite poor, right? And they're so appreciative and careful with the things they have. And they darn and redarn and sew, and like she tears her dress and it has to have patches put on it, right? This is Amakokia. He's like, look, I don't know about you, but I can't afford to tear my clothes. So my skin will heal. So there'll be scratches. Okay, so all of this describes someone, first of all, who has utmost, not just piety, there's a reverence, there's a yirah of chait, right? Exactly what Hanina ben Dosan talked about. Everything he does is, I don't want to misuse someone else's things. I have utmost care for my own things because I know I can't replace them. And now, what is when the master reaches the city, his wife came out adorned in her finery. I love this. He said to them, I will not, so that I not set eyes upon another woman. Okay, so I want to actually reframe that. I have my own reading of this, a woman's reading, not a man's perhaps. Here's a woman who every day her husband goes off and works long, hard hours at work. And she goes out to meet him dressed in her finery. And I really feel that from a woman's perspective, she's showing him how much she values him, right? How much she values their marriage. This is their intimate time. She comes out to the train station to walk him home. And this is the time they have alone together. And she puts on clothes, right? The clothes of drudgery, of the laundry, of the baking and so on. She takes off those clothes and very deliberately puts on clothes that show him that she cared enough for them to print a little, to feel like a woman, right? And she goes out to meet him. And, from a Talmudic perspective, they're always the androcentric gates there and so on. I think they missed the point. That's not why a woman puts on her finery. She puts on her finery because she wants her husband to tell her she looks nice. And she wants him to know that she cared enough about him. He's coming home in his, in his clothes, his work clothes. And this is the time they have to get date night, right? This is the time they have together. In a life of drudgery, you look for these moments of when can we have time where it's just the two of us. And they have children. So once they get home, it's going to be about the children. And I think you see this particularly well in what he does next. So I would rewrite that line if I could and bring perhaps a woman's perspective. You'll let me. You like that? Okay. What is the reason she entered first? Well, he says to her, I don't know who you are. You think I'm going to leave my wife behind me alone with you? Right? Again, there's something very intimate in their relationship. There's real, I feel the love in their relationship and their awareness of the other, because he basically says, of course my wife is going to go into the home first. The home is a safer space. I'm not going to go in and leave her behind me alone with the two of you. I don't know who you are. I can't trust you, right? So this awareness of safety, right, of his wife's vulnerability of two strange men, amazing, right? So I really, again, I think it's quite wonderful. And then what happens next? He says, well, what's the reason you didn't ask us to eat with you? Well, I didn't have enough food, to be quite honest with you. And you guys showed up uninvited. And I know we talk about tzedakah, haknasa orte, but the reality is I have to feed my family first. I have to feed my family first. And I wasn't going to falsely offer you food that I didn't have to offer, which again, I think is such an important message, right? And I said to myself, I don't want to offer you food if I can't serve it to you. And basically, he knows who they are, right? They're not, I'd like to think if they were truly poor people, he would have invited them in and given them something, a shear or something. But he knows who they are. They're the sages. They're coming uninvited. They come fairly regularly, as we know. And he basically says, I just can't. And that's something you need to know. I don't want you to give me anything, but I can't share with you. What is the reason the master, we're almost done, gave the older boy a piece of bread and the younger child too? He says the older child stays at home, and this also, the older child can't go to school. He has ADHD. He just can't. He's better off being homeschooled. And as a result, he can eat whatever he wants. In other words, he can go to the cupboard to take, again, we may not have a lot of food, but he can grab a cracker, a fig, whatever it is. The younger child goes to school. He goes to the synagogue. He comes home hungry. He doesn't have any. He spends a whole day learning, and he's hungrier. And so I am aware of the needs of my family. I am aware that I do not automatically give the older child to because he's the older child. I'm aware of where each of them are all day and what their particular needs are. So again, it's amazing, right? Because we're really seeing here a father, a husband, a man who is really just, right? Really very straight. So they're like, okay, we're not done yet. We're almost done, but we're not. We have some more questions. What is the reason the clouds began to form on the side where the master's wife stood? Because my wife is frequently at home and she gives bread to the poor. So they do give bread to the poor, right? Feeding the sages would have been haknasa orchim, it's true, but this man does not have food to give haknasa orchim to sages who show up. He has food to give to the poor. The poor they're going to give to. And she gives bread to the poor, and therefore her provision is immediate. Whereas I give money. If I have a coin, a pruta, I'll give it to the poor, but I don't give them, they can't eat the pruta. My wife gives them something to eat, and they immediately have something in their stomach, right? They don't have to do anything else. Alternatively, right, now this story is borrowed from the Berea Rebbe Meir story. There were certain hooligans in our neighborhood. I prayed they should die. She prayed they should repent. And they repented, right? There's a similar story told about Berea and Rebbe Meir. But what you have there is this deep respect and affection he has for his wife, right? He's aware of her piety and her righteousness and how she functions when he's not home. There's trust of both of them, of the other, right? What he's doing when he's out, what she's doing when she's out, and when she's out, and so on. And this idea also that, right, that God responded to her prayers first. Because her prayers come from a place of tremendous compassion, not just deen, right, of compassion. That she prayed for the hooligans, that they repent, not that they die. Okay, so we're gonna pause there. Yeah.
So it's just also interesting because all of these things that he does are contrary to convention.
Yeah.
And is it to some extent a critique of the times when people were doing all these things and going to the temple and doing stuff like that, and maybe not really thinking about what is the just thing or the proper thing or the hesed thing to do here. So I don't know, because everything was contrary to what
everything was contrary to what the sages expected. Yeah. But what it says to me is the sages have no idea what it's like to live a life of poverty or simplicity, however you want to call it, to be a laborer. Like they live in the ivory tower of the baby Barash, and they go out and they're asking questions. Sorry guys. They're asking questions, and I feel that's what it's a reality check. It's not that he's being countercultural. I think we are being shown what it means to have to worry about your shoes, about your clothing, what it means to have 2 children, one of whom doesn't go to synagogue, one does, right? What it means to protect your wife, right? They seem to have no clue. So nothing he says, by the way, really surprises us. We read it and we're like, oh, that makes sense. Yeah, right. So it's almost like the sages have to be taught common sense. What that means. Sorry, what were you going to say?
Right. So is it a critique of the state?
No. I don't know if it's a critique. First of all, maybe a little bit, or a wake-up call, or a reality check, I would call it, more than a critique, right? Maybe a little bit of critique. I'm always willing to acknowledge that the Talmud is very happy to self-critique. I see it.
Nechama,
Yeah, please.
Your voice is not perfectly clear to some of us on the Zoom. Number 2, I couldn't find where you just gave that story on the source sheet.
Okay, I'll tell you where it is.
Okay. It's hard to hear when you're giving page. I didn't hear any reference number, and I looked through all the sources while you were talking, couldn't find it. So when you're talking to the class, the Zoom response, the Zoom information is not the same as when we're sitting in class. I understand that, but when you switch to another source, please give a page number or a source number or something, because I got lost twice now. But
okay, I'll just say I didn't skip anywhere. In other words, it was the source after the one about the bears and the goats. I just went
on page 4.
It's on page 4, but it was a direct continuation. If I had skipped to another page, I would have told the class, but I really just read straight down. It says Coney's grandson, what happens next? I will be more considerate to just say we're moving to another source, but it's the text right under Coney's grandson. And I just read the story straight, and it continued on page 4, 5, and 6. It was a long story.
okay.
So my apologies, but I didn't go anywhere. You should know. Otherwise I definitely would have, and I should have been clearer. Thank you. In the future, stop me a little earlier and say, hey, Nechama, I'm not sure where you are. I'd be very grateful if you did that.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay, I'm finished. So thank you. We're going to stop here. We're going to pick up and finish with Hanina Ben-Dosa at the beginning of the next class and move on. I'm not sure who we have next. Stay tuned. Not sure which rabbinic personality we're going to look at, but it'll be good. Thank you.
The stories that are appealing like on our mobile. I mean, I've been learning common for another. I know you are, but it's one blur. Yeah. I'm gonna see. Yeah. I used the sushi thing last week. That was not enough. Oh, so the new one, guys. That's the. I wonder if they get sent out the new one. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Margie just told me that some of you may have been using last week's source sheet, and there was a new one that intertwined 2 material. Okay, I'm really sorry. Thank you. Next time, stop me, and we'll figure that out earlier. Yeah.
On my first journey, unfortunately, I'm not paying as much attention to the